The story of what Patton said when Eisenhower humiliated him publicly begins long before the humiliation itself, in the uneasy relationship between two men who were bound by war but divided by nature. George S. Patton was a soldier born for noise, speed, and violence. He believed war was won by aggression, fearlessness, and absolute confidence. He lived for the battlefield and judged men by their willingness to advance under fire. Dwight D. Eisenhower, on the other hand, was a man shaped by balance and restraint. He was chosen not because he was the fiercest fighter, but because he could manage fragile alliances, political pressure, and egos that could tear the Allied command apart. From the outside, they appeared united. Inside, tension quietly grew with every victory Patton achieved and every headline that followed his name. Patton's success was undeniable. His rapid advances in North Africa and Sicily made him a legend among soldiers and a nightmare for enemies. Men believed that if Patton led them, they would survive and win. That reputation, however, came with a cost. Patton spoke without filters, acted without hesitation, and rarely paused to consider how his actions might look beyond the battlefield. Eisenhower understood something Patton refused to accept. Wars were not fought only with tanks and infantry, but also with public opinion, media, and politics. Every word spoken by a general echoed back to Washington, London, and the families waiting at home. Eisenhower knew that brilliance without discipline could be just as dangerous as incompetence. The moment that changed everything happened not in combat, but in a hospital in Sicily. Patton walked through rows of wounded soldiers, men broken by shell shock, exhaustion, and terror, when he encountered a soldier suffering from what would later be understood as combat stress. Patton saw weakness, not trauma. Overwhelmed by pressure and fury, he struck the man and accused him of cowardice. The room fell silent. Doctors froze. Nurses turned away. That single act, born of Patton's brutal belief in toughness, traveled through the command faster than any official report. When Eisenhower learned of it, he immediately understood the magnitude of the damage. This was no longer about Patton's temper. It was about the image of the American army itself. Eisenhower did not shout when he confronted Patton. He did not insult him or threaten him. Instead, he delivered something far more devastating. With calm authority, Eisenhower explained that Patton's actions had crossed a line that could not be ignored. He told him that the Army could not appear to punish its own soldiers for breaking under pressure while demanding sacrifice from millions at home. Then came the order that cut deeper than any demotion. Patton was required to publicly apologize again and again in front of the very soldiers who once idolized him. For a man who built his identity on strength and dominance, standing before his troops in humiliation was unbearable. As Patton delivered those apologies, something inside him fractured. Soldiers listened in silence. Some forgave him. Others looked away. The fear and respect that once surrounded him were replaced by discomfort and doubt. Eisenhower went further, removing Patton from active combat command. Official statements framed it as discipline and responsibility. Unofficially, everyone understood the message. Eisenhower was asserting control, proving that no general, no matter how brilliant, stood above command or public accountability. For Patton, it felt like exile. The battlefield was where he belonged, and now it had been taken from him. That night, Patton poured his pain into his diary. His words were not those of an angry man, but of a wounded one. He wrote about feeling crushed, about believing he had given everything to the Army only to be stripped of dignity. He questioned whether loyalty mattered when politics entered the room. And then he wrote something that revealed the deepest wound of all. Patton believed Eisenhower had chosen safety over courage, image over effectiveness. He did not accuse Eisenhower of incompetence, but of something worse in Patton's eyes: timidity. In the face of war's brutal realities, what Patton said next was never spoken publicly, but it defined his silence afterward. He believed that Eisenhower feared him, not because he was dangerous to the enemy, but because he was dangerous to order. Patton saw himself as a weapon, one that Eisenhower chose to lock away rather than unleash. In that belief, bitterness mixed with obedience. Patton did not rebel. He did not speak out. He swallowed the humiliation and waited, knowing that history might judge differently than commanders bound by politics. And as Patton waited in the shadows, The war itself seemed to whisper an uncomfortable question. Had Eisenhower done what was right for the army? Or had he sacrificed his most aggressive general to protect a fragile image? That question would not stay buried for long, because the battlefield was about to call Patton back, and when it did, the words he carried inside him would shape everything that followed. As Patton waited in enforced silence, the war did not slow down to accommodate wounded pride or political calculations. Europe was still burning, and the Allies were preparing for the greatest invasion in human history. From a distance, George S. Patton watched as plans were drawn, commands assigned, and histories quietly written without his name at the center. He remained a general in rank, but in spirit he felt invisible, reduced to a symbol rather than a leader. The humiliation Eisenhower imposed did not end with the apologies. It lived on in every briefing Patton was excluded from, and every headline that mentioned other commanders, while his victories faded into memory. Behind closed doors, however, Eisenhower had not truly discarded Patton. He understood Patton's value even as he feared his recklessness. That contradiction defined everything that followed. Eisenhower needed Patton's reputation, his menace, and the fear his name inspired in German intelligence. But he could not risk placing him openly back in command. And so Patton became part of a deception, a phantom general assigned to lead a fictional army meant to confuse the enemy before D-Day. Publicly, Patton was sidelined. Secretly, he was being used as bait for a man who lived to fight. This was another quiet insult, a reminder that his brilliance was useful only when it could be controlled. Patton obeyed, but obedience did not erase the bitterness growing inside him. He trained troops relentlessly, spoke to them with fire, and prepared as if he would soon be unleashed. Yet weeks passed with no real command. In private moments, Patton confided to his diary that he felt like a caged animal, powerful but restrained by men who did not understand the cost of hesitation in war. He believed Eisenhower feared decisive action more than enemy resistance, and that belief hardened into quiet resentment. Still, Patton did not defy orders. His loyalty to the army remained stronger than his anger toward its leadership. When the Allied invasion of Normandy finally began, Patton was forced to watch from the sidelines as others made history. The beaches ran red with blood, and victories were purchased at a terrible cost. Patton followed every report obsessively, criticizing slow advances and missed opportunities in the margins of his notes. He believed speed could save lives, that hesitation only prolonged suffering. Each day, without command, deepened his conviction that Eisenhower's earlier humiliation was not about discipline, but about fear of Patton's independence. Yet even then, Patton said nothing publicly. His silence was strategic, not submissive. Then the call finally came. As Allied forces struggled to break out of Normandy, Eisenhower faced a crisis that demanded aggressive leadership. Reluctantly, but inevitably, he turned back to the one man he knew could move faster than anyone else. Patton was given command of the Third Army, and the moment he returned to the battlefield, everything changed. His forces surged forward with breathtaking speed, cutting through German defenses and liberating towns before the enemy could regroup. Soldiers once again believed they were unstoppable, and Patton's name regained its power. Victory followed victory, and with each success, the memory of his humiliation grew sharper rather than weaker. Privately, Patton reflected on what Eisenhower had done to him. He acknowledged that Eisenhower had eventually trusted him again, but trust did not erase the wound. Patton believed that he had been right all along. That decisive action was the only language war understood. Yet he also realized something more painful. Eisenhower had won in his own way. By humiliating Patton publicly, Eisenhower had proven that no individual, no matter how effective, was larger than the command structure. Patton had been broken just enough to be controlled, and that realization disturbed him deeply. What Patton said during this period was measured, restrained, and filled with bitter clarity. He reportedly remarked that the greatest battles were not always fought against enemies, but against one's own leadership. He believed that history would remember victories, not apologies, and that humiliation faded faster than failure. Those words revealed a man who had learned to endure humiliation without surrendering his belief in himself. He did not forgive Eisenhower, but he no longer needed to confront him. The battlefield had given Patton his voice back. as the Third Army thundered across France. Patton's actions spoke louder than any protest ever could. Each liberated city, each shattered German line, became an unspoken response to the day he had been humiliated. He no longer needed to argue his worth. Yet deep inside, Patton understood that power in war did not belong solely to those who fought hardest, but to those who controlled the narrative. That understanding would follow him to the end of the war, and it would shape how history judged both men. The tension between Patton and Eisenhower never truly disappeared. It merely transformed into an unspoken agreement, a balance between aggression and restraint. And as victory drew closer, one final test would determine whether humiliation had truly changed Patton, or whether the fire inside him would burn just as dangerously as before. That test would come in the frozen forests of Belgium, where Patton's words and actions would once again challenge the very leadership that once broke him. As winter closed in on Europe and the war entered its most desperate phase, the fragile balance between George S. Patton and Dwight D. Eisenhower was tested one final time. The German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, struck with shocking force and threatened to split the Allied lines in half. Panic spread through headquarters as reports poured in of surrounded divisions and collapsing defenses. In that moment of crisis, Eisenhower faced a truth he had long tried to manage rather than admit. Without Patton's speed, audacity, and relentless drive, the Allied front might break. When Eisenhower turned to Patton and asked how long it would take him to pivot his army north to relieve the trapped American forces, Patton's response was immediate and confident. He said he could do it in 48 hours, a statement that stunned everyone in the room. To Eisenhower, it sounded reckless, almost impossible. But Patton did not hesitate, because hesitation was something he believed cost lives. That moment carried the weight of everything that had come before: the humiliation, the silence, the slow return to trust. Patton was no longer asking for approval. He was offering salvation. As Patton's forces surged through snow, mud, and chaos to relieve the besieged troops, the results were undeniable. His army moved faster than anyone believed possible, smashing through German lines and restoring momentum to the Allied campaign. Soldiers cheered his arrival, seeing in him not a disgraced general, but the embodiment of relentless will. For Patton, this was more than a military maneuver. It was his answer to the humiliation he had endured. He did not need to confront Eisenhower with words. The movement of his army said everything. Yet behind the success, Patton remained deeply reflective. In private writings, he acknowledged that Eisenhower had played a long game, one that Patton himself never could. Eisenhower had absorbed criticism, pressure, and fear from every direction while maintaining unity among fragile allies. Patton realized, perhaps for the first time, that Eisenhower's restraint was not weakness, but a different kind of strength. Still, understanding did not erase pain. Patton believed that public humiliation left scars that victories could not fully heal, even when history eventually proved one's worth. What Patton said after these events was quiet and revealing. He remarked that leadership often demanded swallowing injustice in service of something larger than pride. Coming from a man who once believed pride was inseparable from command, this was a profound shift. The humiliation Eisenhower imposed had not destroyed Patton, but it had changed him. He became more controlled in public, more careful with his words, though never less aggressive on the battlefield. In that transformation lay the true cost of Eisenhower's decision. As the war drew to a close, Patton continued to win, but he also grew increasingly frustrated with political restraint and post-war planning. He feared that compromise would undo the sacrifices made on the battlefield. Eisenhower, meanwhile, focused on ending the war cleanly and preventing chaos in its aftermath. Their paths, once parallel, slowly diverged. Patton remained the warrior, uncomfortable with peace, while Eisenhower became the architect of stability. The humiliation that once divided them now symbolized the difference between their destinies. Patton's death shortly after the war ended sealed his legend in tragedy. He never lived to see how history would debate his actions or reinterpret the day he was humiliated. Eisenhower, however, carried that memory into a future shaped by politics and leadership beyond the battlefield. He rarely spoke publicly about the incident, But those who knew him understood that disciplining Patton had been one of the most painful decisions of his command. It was not personal revenge, but a calculated act meant to protect an army fighting a global war. In the end, what Patton said when Eisenhower humiliated him publicly was not delivered in a speech or shouted in defiance. It was written in private words, expressed through disciplined silence, and answered through relentless action. His response was not rebellion, but endurance. History remembers Patton as a warrior who burned brightly and dangerously, and Eisenhower as a leader who held the flame steady. Together, their conflict revealed a deeper truth about leadership in war: that greatness often emerges not from harmony, but from tension, sacrifice, and the willingness to bear humiliation for the sake of victory. And so the story closes not with a victor and a villain, but with two men who carried the weight of the world in different ways, bound forever by a moment of public humiliation and a lifetime of unspoken understanding.